Gironlands, Gironzano, Gironzalon.
All right. Good morning. Today is April 2nd, 2020, and we welcome Daniel Mendelsohn to a very special edition of Incroci di Civiltà. Today was supposed to be the opening day of Incroci di Civiltà number 13, but we've decided to have a very unique, unprecedented, and hopefully not to be replicated Incroci 12 and a half. And we really want to thank our friends and guests who have accepted to be here in such extraordinary circumstances. We thought it was so important that Incroci would still be there in some sort, in some form. And Daniel Mendelsohn needs no introduction. He has been a very welcome guest to Incroci di Civiltà in the past. He was recently in Venice, and we'll simply start by asking the unavoidable question. So, good morning, Daniel. How are you? Where are you? And how are you living the current situation?
Well, I'm in the countryside, actually, about 2 hours north of New York City. And that's where I've been since the first lockdown took place at the beginning of March. So I'm up here. I'm currently in my partner's house, so my niece can quarantine in my own house, and then I'll rejoin her as soon as she's fine. Everyone in my family, thank God, is well so far, but of course, as you know, we're just at the beginning of the curve, so we'll see what happens. It is, you know, if you're a writer and a student of literature, there's a kind of a familiar ring to the idea of escaping to the countryside in order to get away from a terrible plague. So I feel very shadowed by Boccaccio in this country retreat that I find myself in. But everyone's so far so good, thank God.
All right, and I know this is a very big question, but how do you see the American situation altogether from your perspective, and sort of just maybe a snapshot of?
Well, you know, it's no secret that we are doubly in despair here. We're in despair because of the epidemiological situation, which is inevitable. We're in particular despair because we have the worst possible political leadership at a time of great national emergency. So all of the frustration and revulsion that one had been feeling since 2016 has reached a fury, and his administration have obviously just been completely inept and continue to be both inept and I would say malicious in the handling of this. So we have, as I said, double despair, one over the health situation and the other over the political situation. Obviously they're connected, and the health situation is far worse than it should have been because of this. So, you know, it's an interesting situation because, you know, as a writer, as a student of literature, we know about plagues. It's a historical phenomenon that has manifested itself in some of the greatest literature that we know of, from Thucydides to Boccaccio to Camus, you know. And I must say it tests one's faith. Although I think literature passes the test, you know, about what we can learn from literature, particularly because the nature of this illness requires that people be alone at home. And therefore there's a lot of time for reading. more so than ever. I think reading and cooking are the two activities that here, at least, people find themselves enjoying more than ever. So I'm thinking a lot about plague literature lately, obviously, but it's a very anxious time, and as I said, because one can have no faith in the political side of things, it makes it doubly scary. You know, I wish Obama were president. I would have a lot more faith in how things are being handled.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. You've just mentioned that literature is always a great companion in life, even more so in situations like these. For this short conversation, I have a pile of books here, and I have only one question per book. So don't worry, you have a long day ahead of you. I don't want to take too much of your time. But since you mentioned that, so in fact, you've already referenced the Boccaccio and the Decameron. So in a conversation from a few, I think a couple of weeks ago, you were mentioning that you were actually doing something with the Decameron that is pretty relevant in these days. So can you explain what you've been doing with Boccaccio, not in relation to your sort of latest book, which will be mentioned later, but in terms of reading Boccaccio in this time of coronavirus?
Well, I think, inevitably, everybody, particularly in publishing, writers, intellectuals, has felt a need to record the moment, so to speak, and people are writing think pieces, and every publication now has a pandemic journal, including the New York Review of Books. And I don't know what I think yet. I need more time to process my own thoughts. So I turned to Boccaccio, whom I had not really read since university days. And I've been live tweeting the Decameron for it's almost a month now. I started just as a kind of a goof, something to distract myself. Because there's something about translating that has a very focusing effect. And I thought, I'll do a couple of paragraphs a day just to brush up on my translating, and it's a good way of getting back into the text when you're translating, because it makes you go deeper. Excuse me. So I'm about into my first month of what I call Decameron Corona. That's my hashtag. And every day I don't know, I tweet about a paragraph or two in a thread, and sometimes with a little commentary, and some people have been following it. People I think right now keep constantly hearing the name Boccaccio, the Decameron. They have some idea it's about a plague. People were running away to the countryside, telling stories. So that's just mostly for my own entertainment. But I do think I'm just finished with the introduction to the first day. And that is an incredibly harrowing account of the Black Death in Florence. I mean, it's just epidemiologically, socially, politically, religiously, it's so interesting to see his interest in human nature and how it expresses itself under this particular kind of stress. And some of the things that he talks about in 1348 are exactly out of the headlines now, unfortunately. The inability to bury all the bodies, this, all that kind of stuff. It's an exact replay of what he writes about. So I'm very happy that I finished with that, because I'm about to get to the first tale, which will be a lot more fun. But he says, you have to know the history of the plague in order to understand the novelle themselves, right? He said it's like a hiker is approaching a terrible steep mountain, and first you have to go over the terrible mountain, and once you're over the mountain, you're in the beautiful meadows, and that's the novelle, is the beautiful meadows, and the mountain is really steep and difficult.
Well, thank you. Well, when at some point you'll get to the one of the uh, stories it's set in Venice, and Boccaccio doesn't have a lot of fine things to say about Venice.
No,
I don't
no.
know how it translates. D'ogni bruttura ricevitrice, a kind of repository of all filth or something like that. But on this topic, one thing that strikes me is that not only do we read literature, or do I read literature in these days, looking for a direct representation of situations that resemble this one, but also how you reread literature has nothing to do with the plague. Like, we read that novella that Boccaccio sets in Venice with the friar passing as the archangel Gabriel to sleep with a lady. And you, all of a sudden, in this moment where Venice is a ghost town, you appreciate those very comic, ordinary types of social interaction that are now have been completely prohibited, and they give
Yeah.
you an incredible sensation and thrill. And funnily enough, if the friar were to dive into the Grand Canal today, if he would find it cleaner than ever because of the situation in front of the
And he would be swimming with dolphins.
it was swimming a dolphin and crocodiles. All right. The onto a different book. Of course, when you were at Incroci, your fabulous book that are here in both editions was not out yet. You talked about the Odyssey when you were here in Venice a few months ago within the Edmund de Waal Psalm exhibition. But again, rereading this fantastic book that has so much to offer for so many different contexts, there is a page where you talk about your father and his experience of the war. And there is this question that you ask, which is, what might a heroism of survival look like? And you talk about what it means to be a hero in terms of survival. And also in the following page, you talk about your father's attitude to crying and to the show of vulnerability, which is something that is not considered very manliness. Now, those two lines resonated particularly because it seems to me that in these days there's a lot of discussion. First of all, in terms of how our culture copes with showing vulnerability, reacting to vulnerability, but also with this discourse of survival. And so do we need a heroism of survival now? Can we learn something from the Odyssey or the other classics?
Well, I mean, the Odyssey is so interesting because it's funny because I'm teaching right now a seminar on classical epic, and we just finished the Odyssey. So it's been very much on my mind lately. I mean, it's always on my mind, but particularly. And I had a very interesting conversation with my students about the difference between the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the Iliad essentially posits a heroism of death. One could say that the greatest glory lies in living briefly but brilliantly. And that's, of course, the choice of Achilles. But the Odyssey, in a post-war world, has to imagine a different kind of heroism. And it's what I call a heroism of survival, that being a survivor is a kind of heroism. It's interesting, Shaul, it connects to my other book, Gli Scomparsi, because I remember Froma, my dear friend Froma Zeitlin, the classicist, who's also writes about the Holocaust. And there was a moment about 10, 15 years ago where a number of movies were coming out from Hollywood about the Shoah and emphasizing partisan resistance, armed partisan resistance. And I went to see one of these movies about the partisans of Vilna with Froma. And she looked at me, she said, it's so American to think that the only kind of resistance is armed, violent resistance. And she said a thing to me that stuck in my mind, and I always think about it when I'm teaching the Odyssey. She says, hiding was a form of resistance. Surviving was a form of resistance, however you did it. People hidden in these terrible places for years and years. And I think that's in some sense, the key to understanding the Odyssey. You know, Odysseus, remember, Achilles says, I hate like the gates of hell, a man who says one thing but does another. In other words, a liar. Because he's the emblem of a certain kind of heroism which flourishes in broad daylight. But Odysseus famously is a liar and a cheat and a spy and will do anything to survive. He disguises himself, he endures humiliation, teasing, starvation, anything to survive. So I think a lot about Odysseus right now. You know, particularly at this moment when I think because of the technological world we live in, the social media, everyone feels it necessary to comment, to display, you know, and I think sometimes just chugging along quietly and persistently is the Odyssean way to deal with things. You don't always have to be showing off how you're doing, how funny you are, how clever you are about everything. You know, sometimes just putting your head down and continuing walking ahead is the best kind of heroism. So I do think there's a kind of Odyssean lesson there. And that's why you know, it's funny because that's the kind of person my father was, a kind of grimly determined, dutiful person. And yet he never liked Odysseus for some reason. So go figure, you know.
All right, so next on my pile is not a book, but it's a movie from my son's collection.
Oh my goodness.
Which is a sort of, you know, very straightforward adaptation of a classical mythology into popular culture. But
Right.
this is my little stage prop to invite you to comment on another activity that many of us are indulging in these days. You know, binge watching is one of the great resources in this lockdown time. So popular culture. So you've written very eloquently about popular culture, and in your most recent book of essays, The Ecstasy of Terror, you've shown how the classics not only continue to exist as, you know, modern editions of the text, but also as adaptations that sometimes are not even obvious in the titles and plots. So can you say something about this sort of permanence of classical culture, maybe one example or two in popular culture, so that we can even have the impression that, you know, as we watch a series on the sofa, we're doing something highly intellectual?
Well, you know, although I would say right now, I think we can forgive ourselves if we don't want to do something highly intellectual. You know, it's perfectly okay to watch schlock. Well, it is interesting to me. You know, I'm always making this point that because the Greek and Roman classics are one of the two foundations of Western civilization, the other being the biblical tradition, we always invoke it at times of stress because they have greater authority than anything. And so it's an interesting story about the relevance of the classics. So I have a lovely young colleague, super smart guy, who last week sent me a piece he had written about Thucydides. You know, at the beginning of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, he describes in great detail, in a way that eerily anticipates Boccaccio, this terrible plague that hit Athens at the beginning of the war and devastated the population of Athens. And like Boccaccio, Thucydides is interested in the sociology of the plague, the politics, all of that. So my colleague wrote a little piece and he said, you know, this is really not a scholarly piece, it's something more for the mainstream media. Can you help me find some website or publication to publish? And I said, sure. And every editor I know gave the same response, which is, this is a great piece, but we've already published so many pieces about Thucydides and the plague. So I'm thinking, it's just so interesting to me that there's this natural impulse to recur to the classics because it's always the prototype for how we think of a given situation. So people are writing about Thucydides, they're writing about Oedipus Rex, which begins with the city of Thebes afflicted by a plague, which the people appeal to Oedipus to cure, even though they don't know yet that he's the cause. So I think it's inevitable that this material is invoked. It always happens. You can't get away from it, you know.
In the book, you write about very successful TV series such as Games of Thrones and things like that. Can you give us an example of how there is a sort of classical matrix in some popular narratives from today?
Well, I mean, look, you, as we all know, there were only about 5 plots in all of literature, and they just keep being recycled. You know, I was mentioning this just the other day in connection, not with TV series, but two modern pop culture items, The Count of Monte Cristo and the movie Gladiator, which are essentially the same plot. And they're both based on the Odyssey, right? A great hero is, against his will, abducted or secreted somewhere. He learns all these arcane skills. He comes back. He takes revenge. You know, but you know, Game of Thrones, as you know, I really liked, and I think when I reviewed it for the New York Review of Books, I said it's like something out of Tacitus, because it's really about power. And one of the things that was exciting about it, now we have this new show that I just started watching. Of course, I can't remember the name of anything anymore, about a sort of Rupert Murdoch-like tycoon and his horrible family.
Billionaire, you know.
No, it's not billionaire.
Succession.
You know, those are all basically classical narratives, right? I mean, it goes, if not Greek and Roman, it certainly goes back to King Lear, obviously. You know, so everything is a rewrite, basically, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, when you think of it, how few genuinely original story types there are. You know, the only kind of storyline that doesn't exist in the Greek and Roman world is the detective story.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I take that back, because Oedipus really is the first detective story, one could say. So it is interesting how that, the sun is coming out, it's right in my face.
That's a wonderful atmospheric touch.
Yes, right. The little chiaroscuro can't hurt in an Italian interview.
Okay, so talking about everything being essentially a rewrite, the next book on the pile is the masterpiece by Erich Auerbach's Mimesis, and I'll let you explain why I'm showing this, just because I'm referring to a book that I don't have physically in my hands. But so this is
will soon, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm going to explain why.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, because.
So my next book, which is coming out in Italy this autumn, I think, hopefully, it's a small book about writers in exile, basically, and it connects this historical phenomenon. I look at 3 writers who, for one reason or the other, either were forced into exile or voluntarily exiled. One of them is Erich Auerbach, the author of Mimesis, one of the great literary studies of all time, which is really a survey of all of Western literature and examining passages from great works, trying to understand how they make human experience feel real on the page. How is reality represented? And I entwine the story of these three writers. The first one is Auerbach, whom was a refugee from Hitler and ended up in Istanbul during World War II, where he wrote this great study of Western civilization, which is rather ironic, given that Western civilization was tearing itself apart at the time that he was extolling its literature in his book. And I also look at François Fénelon, the author of Les Aventures de Télémaque, who was exiled by Louis XIV at the end of his life. And I look at W.G. Sebald, and I entwine the idea of historical exile with a certain kind of digressive narrative that each one of those writers is interested in or practices. And I try to entwine together this sort of real exile or wandering with a kind of narrative wandering. Actually, the epigraph to my first chapter is the third tale from day one of the Decameron, the story of the three rings. That's where I got my title from. So it's a book about, I mean, it's a sort of literary study, but it also has, as everything I do does, has a kind of autobiographical element, because it's also the story of how difficult it was for me to write my Odyssey book and trying to find the right narrative form. So it sort of twines together a historical thread, a personal thread, and a literary critical thread. And those are the three elements.
Allow me to make a comment on that. I think in these days, for those of us who teach for a living, our whole profession has been put in a whole new dimension. And for some, teaching online has been really challenging. And I must say that, among other things, the book on the Odyssey is great inspiration, because it sort of forces you to think of how much teaching is intertwined with your life, with your biography. And it seems to me that even the new book, the Three Rings book, has to do with, and Auerbach is the perfect example of how you see things from a very different perspective when you are forcefully removed from your ordinary life, and you have to, in a way, take into account everything that your whole value system and your whole world stands for. So it seems to me that all your books are, recommend themselves as really essential reading for our moment.
Well, I'm very interested in teaching, and I think about it a lot. And a lot of my books are about my own teachers, because as a classicist, I'm always interested in how you become part of the tradition. And part of how you become part of a tradition is to be absorbed into it by your teachers. I think there's something else about Mimesis, which is very apt for the present moment, which is about people continuing to do their work under the most difficult circumstances. Every time a student of mine writes to me saying they're having a nervous breakdown because they're not going to meet the paper deadline or, whatever. And I think of Auerbach, in Istanbul, writing one of the greatest literary studies of all time, because that's what you do. You just persist. To come back to our earlier point, what do you do in times of trouble? You just persist. That's what you have to do. I should say, there's a famous sort of legend about Auerbach, who was a great literary scholar, and he found himself in Istanbul at the university, where he had luckily found a job. And there's this sort of legend, which is not entirely true, that he wrote this book, which contains long analyses of passages from everything from Homer to Proust. And there's this legend that he wrote it basically from memory, because the libraries at the University of Istanbul were not at the level of the libraries in the universities in Germany. And it's not quite true. They did have actually some pretty good libraries. But one of my favorite parts of that is, in order to write certain parts of the book, he needed access to the patristic literature, the literature of the Church Fathers. And the nice Monsignor who gave him permission to use the library of a monastery in Istanbul was none other than Roncalli, who became Pope John the 23rd. So I always like to say he was always a mensch, Roncalli, from the very beginning.
That's true. He was a good pope in many ways. So the last book I had was Sebald, but you've already touched upon him. So basically, Daniel, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. This is
great to see you.
Great conversation, and I'm sure that Incroce's readers look forward to having another chance to welcome you in Venice. But for now, I think that this is exactly the kind of special opportunity that this condition allows us. So good luck, and I'll hope to meet in person and celebrate
very
the
soon,
book before too long. Thank you
yeah,
so much.
Same here. Thanks. Ciao, ciao, ciao. Bye.
Amici, Masa.
Vagano, vagano, vagano!